like everybody has practiced raising and putting down their hands. Today we're going to talk about the basic principles of design. A lot of you are maybe amateur graphic designers. Some of you are doing digital at like a local union. Some of you maybe work with graphic designers, and regardless of sort of where you fit into the spectrum, you should get some useful information today, and I believe in you. You can do this. It's not rocket science. And here we go. We're going to start our journey together. The objective of today's training is that you can walk away at the end of this hour with a basic understanding of the core principles of effective visual communication and the different elements that we'll use to achieve those principles. And I'll just quick run through our agenda. I'm going to introduce myself. We're going to talk about head, heart, and hand skills. I will give a big picture overview. Then we'll dive deeper into individual principles and elements of design and have a note on style. And at the very end, we'll have some time for questions. So if you find yourself having a question, just jot it down. And at the end, we will take your questions. Also, if at any point you can't hear me or I'm talking way too quickly or something, you can, I believe, indicate that in the area where you would raise your hand. So let's do this. Let's dive right in. First of all, a little bit about me. My name is Sarah Baker, and I'm the creative director at the New Organizing Institute in DC. And as you can see from this picture, I've been into art for a very long time. This is my first grade self-portrait. Fast forward to college, I ended up studying painting, and then strangely enough, the painting factory was not hiring when I graduated, so I moved to New York and joined the cubicle army, and eventually I became sort of a modern-day seasonal worker where I would work in politics on Democratic primaries in the spring and summer and fall, and then I did freelance graphic design in the off-season. So that's a little bit about my experience. And in addition to being the thing that has paid my rent for most of my recent adult life, this is cheesy, but design has also been a way for me to express all the different feelings I have and to celebrate things like this, like friends who are getting married, to joke around, to support change in my neighborhood and in my community, and also to combine my passions for adorable things and politics. So I'm excited to share with all of you today my love of design, and hopefully some of that will rub off on you. So moving right along, one of the first things we're going to talk about are head, heart, and hand skills. They're the three big components in the art-making process. And in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on head knowledge, the head skills you'll need to think critically about creating effective design work. And you all already have the heart skills with the way that you have so much passion for your work and the care that you have for what you're doing on the ground, especially at the local level, the relationships that you have with the families who are directly impacted by things like living wages and workers' benefits. All of that contributes to that heart that you already have. And then, of course, the last thing is the hand skills. There are a variety of ways after this presentation you can seek those out. Whether it's doing an online training or some different in-person trainings on design software. That's something that if you're interested in design, you can also pursue. But today, we're going to focus on those head skills. So for me, this is a good example of combining head, heart, and hand skills. A designer made this right after that devastating earthquake in Japan a couple of years ago. And the designer obviously used their head skills to choose the colors and a legible font and a clever concept combining that national flag with a Band-Aid. Obviously their hand skills were used to put this all together in the Illustrator software. But it's really those heart skills, the personal, emotional aspect of this that really makes the image resonate. So as you're looking to make powerful content or collaborate on powerful content that will resonate, just keep these things in mind, your head, heart, and hand skills. So, next thing we're going to talk about is Gestalt, which is a word that I learned in art school, and it speaks to the fact that an organized whole is perceived as more than the sum of its parts, which can also mean that a good design will have a sense of unity to it. I like to say that elements look like they live in the same universe, It's just a lot of elements working together to communicate one idea successfully, although it doesn't necessarily mean sameness. And a way that I want to illustrate Gestalt a little bit for you is that if someone were to hand you a box of 64 crowns and ask you to draw a leafy summertime treetop scene, you probably wouldn't pick this color crown out of the box, this sort of mustardy, brown color, right? That's not going to be your first choice. A lovely tree that would make. Not really, just kidding. But this is a Cezanne painting where you'll see that that mustardy color is actually used in these treetop summer scenes. That speaks to this idea of Gestalt, that every element is relative to the other elements in the work. And this mustard color is working here in these treetops. So since everything is relative, a question like, is this too bright or is this text too big, it can only really be answered by looking at your whole project. And how do we achieve these designs that are unified whole works with this concept of Gestalt, as opposed to a collection of parts? And how do we tie these things together to make them cohesive, coherent sets of information? Well, the way that we're going to do that is by really delving into these principles of design, which, believe it or not, are called the CRAP principles. They'll guide you towards making things that are unified and visually interesting. So CRAP stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And then here are some other elements that you're going to use. These are like tools in your toolbox that you'll use to achieve those CRAP principles. So that's line, color, shape, scale, texture, and space. For instance, like right now, I'm using color to create contrast on this slide. We're going to go through each of these principles and each of the elements more in depth, and I'll be talking about how the elements are used and employed in various design examples. So let's start right off with contrast. It's the state of being strikingly different from something else, typically something in juxtaposition or close association, and contrast allows us to emphasize what is important. Now here I'm going to be using examples not just from the world of politics and organizing, but also just from popular culture. They're pretty helpful in illustrating a lot of these principles, and oftentimes you'll see something cool in like a magazine or on another website that might not apply directly to organizing, but you can bring it into your work. So you'll see all different kinds of examples here. So first of all, I use this example, this Mad Men ad, as a contrast example because you see a really high color contrast. You've got just the black, white, a little gray, and like a stark red creates a real striking contrast. And we also have a cool bit of symmetry that you'll notice. But right there, it's a pretty striking example of contrast in color. Here, this little poster for Believe in Yourself, they're using color contrast where you have the letters that spell out BU in that darker, dark gray. They're contrasting, vibrating really intensely against the yellow background, but then the rest of the letters are just that light gray color, so they're contrasting a lot less. So it does this thing which you notice right away, which is it says Believe in Yourself, and it also says BU. So using contrast, certain letters come to the forefront, and you can kind of emphasize a certain message. And I like this example. It's from back in the day with the WPA, the Works Projects, from a New York City housing poster, but it's just using three basic colors, the red, blue, and yellow, along with black, in a simple way to have a high contrast design that's really visually interesting. So it doesn't have to be these crazy examples. Sometimes just using a couple of colors in a restrained palette with a high contrast can make a cool impact. Now this might be a familiar scene to some of you who have an iPhone. There's a subtle contrast going on here, but it's an important factor in how we perceive the organization of this information. You'll notice that in these results that Siri returned to me on my phone, you have the first result that comes up, it's in a white, And then the one below it, it just has a little bit of a light gray background, and it alternates back and forth with that white and gray to define these different spaces and make you realize that these are different entries that you're seeing. It's a really subtle thing you wouldn't even notice, but it's helping you organize this information in your head. And oftentimes in design, you're given a complex set of information that you need to put into a digestible format. So different things like this, even subtle contrasts, can help you to put information together in a way that people are able to interact with really easily. And this is an example from Credo, one of their Facebook share graphics, but it's really basic. Number of days since the beginning of the financial meltdown, number of bankers who've gone to jail. Here, again, we see a stark color contrast, but we also see a cool content contrast where they're using this number idea to create even more stark contrast, because it's 1,500 days and 0 have gone to jail. So you can think about contrast also in terms of your content. The next of the principles we're going to go through is repetition, which obviously it's the recurrence of an object or an event, and it can create consistency and show that things are related. So the first example, again, we're going to go to is just an iPhone lock screen, and I want to talk through a little bit about the way repetition is being used in these instances. We see that the icons to the left, they're all these sort of rounded square shapes being repeated all the way down, so you know immediately that that visual information is communicating a certain, letting you know what type of message you have, whether it's a missed phone call or whatever. You look to that area with the square to find out that info. Then you have the person who called or emailed or messaged you. Their information is repeatedly in the same font size and bold. We're using the repetition of that over and over to communicate, what that piece of information is. And then over here, you even have the time coming in, same font size, same color, same bolding. That way, with repetition in this basic screen, you always know if you're just going to glance at your iPhone, kind of what information you're looking at, because it's repeating these elements over and over again. And help you to kind of stay organized and efficient. So this next example that I want to use is from this great state rep in Arkansas that I got to meet. He, I think, is a state senator in Fayetteville, and he's also a graphic designer, so he obviously makes really cool Facebook share graphics for himself. I want to show you a few of his posters and point out some of the repetition that's happening there. So this is just a reminder for people to go vote. But then we see this, I support tuition equity and the DREAM Act. And then this is an endorsement message. Then we have a new set of different share graphics. We've got this one about unemployment, this one about cutting taxes, and then this last one about Affordable Care Act. So you can see that these three posters or the three graphics are all going together because we're repeating certain elements. In this case, we have the same background color. We're using the same types of fonts and the same sort of overall square shape with the graphics. This lets anybody know if they're familiar with this guy's Facebook page and they happen to see this pop up in their news feed. Without even probably reading this graphic, they're going to know, oh, that's from Greg Letting, my rep, because immediately they sort of identify in the back of their mind that this is how he tends to put things together. From the production side of things, if you're keeping some sort of repetitive format with these types of graphics, it can also really cut down on your production time, because you already know, you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about how will I lay this out, what font should I use, because you're repeating those elements over and over again. And at the same time, you're branding yourself and looking, kind of organized and chic. So that's a pretty good example there of repetition. In this case, this is a catalog, I think, about, I want to say a poetry festival or something like that. But the big elements you'll see repeated here are circles, and then the same color scheme of a sort of transparent blue, red, and yellow. So you can see on the cover there, you have the pictures cut out in circles, And here you'll see more different circle elements all throughout. Sometimes they're, sort of big, sometimes they're small, sometimes they're in a corner. But these circle elements and this unified color scheme are really holding things together in this catalog. The repetition of that helps this catalog to feel like one coherent, cohesive body of work. So the next of the craft principles we're going to talk about is alignment. Alignment allows elements to create visual connections to one another, and it intentionally creates order. So again, we're going back to this example where we have justified alignment. Justified means that the text will take up the space of the box that you draw. So in this instance, Arkansas Democrats have cut. It's just as long as the line below it, which is 730 million. Most of you are probably familiar with a justified alignment as well as right, left, and center alignment if you use any basic text editing software like Microsoft Word. So it's not a new concept to you. But then in design, you'll find that we have even more tools to work with alignment because you start to deal with more and more types of information, and as the quantity of information grows, you need some more tools in your tool belt when it comes to alignment other than just left, right, center, justified. So one of those ways that designers oftentimes will deal with complex information is imposing a grid. In this instance, all these many pieces of information could look really like a hot mess if it weren't for the fact that this designer chose a really obvious grid. As you can see with the pink outline that I put up there, he's creating the sense of order in your mind by breaking things out into a grid. Most of the elements on that page with the pink lines are small boxes, but then you have that number 4.39 that's going to be bigger. It's a big contrast in size, and so it's just 4 times the size of one of the small boxes. So in this instance, it's a pretty good example of a grid just to keep things organized. And this is just an alternate example of a grid. Again, you're also seeing some repetition here in shape and another grid. Poetry oftentimes will use alignment to let you know where stanzas are. And so, you know kind of like when the beginning of something is, etc. That's a good example of alignment if you're still struggling through kind of what that might mean. This is a Lord of the Rings poster example that an artist drew up, but it's a great example of symmetry and balance. I think in these images you have, I'm not a Lord of the Rings expert, but it's some sort of tower on top, and then you have your line, and below the earth some sort of, crevice or cave. The tower balances out the cave below it in a really neat way because there's some symmetry happening there. It's not exact symmetry, but it's pretty close, and it creates a sort of visually appealing scenario for the viewer. And a quick side note, because I know a lot of you might be working on Facebook share graphics, so even though it's not totally an alignment thing, I just wanted to briefly talk about margins. This is one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make, especially when it comes to these share graphics. This person here did a good job of sort of mirroring the curve of the senator's face with the text, and there's logical movement happening in that text, but there's basically no margins there. And the end result is that the text looks like it's been sort of shoehorned into the photo. It looks crowded and busy, which is a shame. On the other hand, this is a pretty good example from the president's Facebook page, where the text is well spaced. It has enough room to live and breathe on the graphic, and you can kind of get a little bit more out of it, or feel less stressed out maybe looking at the layout of it. And the Obama Facebook page in general is a great place to go if you find yourself sort of being an amateur designer and having to put together graphics, especially Facebook share graphics. They always have great examples of different types of layout of photos and text that are great to learn from and experiment with on your own and then use for your own purposes. So I'd highly recommend checking. And then on the topic of margins, this is another Credo graphic where you can see that they don't really have margins here, but it's done in a really skillful way where it's creating tension and really showing movement with the text. So I don't want you to think it's a total rule that you must have these margins, but I just wanted to make you all aware of the fact that it's a good idea to strive for some. So the last of the main principles we're going to talk through is the one that people sometimes find most confusing, and it's called proximity. Proximity is when you have things near in space or relationship, and by placing similar types of information close to one another, these things become more of a visual unit. So the idea of proximity is putting things close to each other so that they look like a little group of information. The first example I'm just going to show you is a movie poster, because this is one of the most typical examples of proximity that you'll see maybe in your day-to-day life, where you know to look at the very bottom. There's always this sort of fine print text that's giving out technical information and producers and this and that. It's stuff that it's all in the same font. It's all grouped closely together, and you know it's not the most important piece of information. But then oftentimes towards the top you'll see a grouping of actors' names, and when they're all together like that, you're kind of reading them as a group. This example is from the table of contents of, I think, like Esquire magazine. But you'll see in each of these different instances, for instance, right here you have the number 6. It says a letter from the editor and explaining what you're reading. Over here, 12, the style guide and a little description. So each of these little groupings of text, they're put together so that you know it's page 12, it's called the style guide, and then there's a short description of it. Things are all grouped together so that you know they all go together as one piece of information, instead of just being like disparate pieces of information. So now we're going to dive into the different elements that we use to achieve those 4 principles we talked about. And again, those crap principles, if we were all in the classroom, I would make you kind of shout them out at me, but we have C, contrast, R, repetition, A, alignment, and P, proximity. So we're going to figure out with these elements how we achieve the principles we just talked about. So the first element we'll talk about is line. Line is basic enough. You all obviously know what a line is, but there are different ways that you can employ lines in your design to delineate space and to let people know about relationships that different pieces of information have to one another. In this case, it's a little map about what was happening in the 5 boroughs of New York, and lines are defining space in a couple of different ways, both by the text boxes that are outlined and by the lines that make up the silhouette of the 5 boroughs. Then you also have lines that are showing the relationship of those text boxes to the object of the map and a place. In this instance, again, you have these dotted lines, and they're showing a relationship to the object. You'll also note the repetition of circles that's used really well here, and some nice symmetry too. And here we have, again, lines showing relationships to an object. I love this. This is, I think, Ollie Moss. He's like a designer and illustrator, and he reinvents ideas of movie posters. So here, just showing using a really basic scheme of line and dots, he has basically told the plot of what happens in 3 Back to the Future movies there, which is pretty clever. So it also underscores the point that, you know, design isn't necessarily rocket science. You can use really basic elements like this to create your point sometimes. It's just a matter of sort of practicing and getting comfortable with doing that. I love this. Another designer did a whole grouping of different words where he took the actual text of a word and then aimed to illustrate the meaning of the text just using the letters. Here the line of the X starts to personify a person in motion, like running, to the I, which has been just sort of tilted to look like a door. In this instance, designers will often talk about letter forms, which is just a fancy word for letters, basically. But it just means you're looking at the shape, the form created by the letter, and thinking about what else that could be used for. In this case, another clever one with horizon. Obviously, the one O is down, one's up, and you're thinking about a horizon line. So we're going to switch over now to talk about color. Color is something you've probably all studied in school way back in the day. As it pertains to your designs and the stuff you're working on, just some stuff to remember is that you have your sort of complementary colors, which are colors that sort of create a nice contrast with one another. So those would include red and green, orange and blue, and yellow and purple. Those colors in their different forms sort of work together to show nice contrast in a relationship. But you can also do things like monochromatic schemes where you're working with sort of one color, or analogous color schemes where you're working with a couple of colors all next to each other, like red, orange, yellow type thing. There are a lot of different ways to play with color, and I can see if I can give Chris some later to send around to you all for different cool online tools that help you design color schemes if that's something that you have to do for like a document or a graphic or something. And in this instance, I grabbed this from the Wisconsin AFL-CIO Facebook cover photo. And what I like about the color in this particular image is, first of all, it obviously conveys patriotism. You've got these red, sort of almost stripy looking things. And then the white stars and the blue workers' fists. Then beyond the patriotism, I think that the red here is conveying some strength. And it sort of reinforces that message of strength that's also in the title there, Workers Indivisible. So in a chart like this, they give you kind of some different ideas about what different colors sometimes are perceived as. So I'll make sure that Chris has this that you can take a look at later. But think about kind of, play around with different colors, see which ones work and which ones help to reinforce your message. Shapes. So this is kind of interesting. Right away, when you look at this Credo graphic, you probably see a shape in the text. And it's obviously a triangle. Again, it's cool to look at sort of the text that you have to work with for a graphic or a headline or whatever it is that you're making, and sometimes see if you can make an interesting shape out of it. It can get really gimmicky, so you don't want to do it too much, but in this instance, it's not too gimmicky, and it kind of works really nicely and neatly to start with the most important piece of information, like we want you to pass this, that's the action word. And it narrows it all the way down, Violence Against Women Act, and leads your eye down to Credo's logo down there, which is pretty cool. Again, this is from that series of a designer looking at different ways to arrange letters and whatnot. But he looked at the P and realized if he turned it on its side, it was very similar to an eye patch, so filled that in, made pirate. Same thing with tsunami, looking at the shape of that S, and then just making that really large to look like a wave. So working with these letter forms, looking at what shapes they really are, and playing with that can be really fun in different contexts. Here, this was for, I think, a cafe or a business or something called Coco, but they looked at sort of the natural stuff in front of them, these coconuts, and realized that when you cut one in half, stick it next to a whole one, you're looking at like CO, CO. So they have that, and they translated those basic shapes to be their logo. So shapes are everywhere. You see a lot of shapes in letter forms, and it's fun to be aware of that and think about different ways to play with that in your design. This is a really unsuccessful instance of that, where this poor food editor or this designer of this newspaper decided to put, they saw a sort of a G in the section of a grapefruit, but not everybody else saw that, and so this became a bit of an internet phenomenon because it looks like, instead of grapefruit, it almost looks like grapefruit. So that's just a warning to everybody that if you have a clever idea or you're using a letter form or shape in a new way, maybe run it by a couple of your colleagues first. Make sure everyone is on the same page and definitely reading or seeing what you see. So the next element we'll talk about is scale. And scale is basically just size. Scale's really important in sort of conveying not only, relationships in terms of quantity, like something is bigger than another thing, but it can also help with showing importance of different objects. In this particular chart, it's increase in exports from Africa, and the cool thing about scale in this, used in this chart, is that you don't even really need to look at this for more than 1.5 seconds to know that the biggest increase is happening into Asia, followed very far behind by the US, followed by the EU. Scale can help communicate more complex ideas very, very quickly. This designer is probably handed a table of information, which takes some time to read through and pull out the most important pieces of info from, but then they translated it into this graphic that just really quickly anyone can take a look at. Bam, it's obvious kind of what's happening there. So scale is a really great tool in your toolbox to create contrast, to create repetition, etc. It's a next, we're talking about texture. And texture is really important in giving visual interest to your designs. With different software programs, you can actually add in textures, like in Photoshop. That's a great thing that you can do there. I love this example because in this chart, they're making the anatomy of a cupcake, and they figured, hey, we'll just lay everything out and let the natural elements create the texture. So you're actually looking at icing and sprinkles and milk and flour, etc. You're probably all gonna end this conference call and want to go get a cupcake, so I apologize. But I love that example for the creative use of texture. And then here, this is a chart where it's looking at the height of different, some of the tallest mountains in the world. And instead of just making a regular bar graph or whatever, or a line graph, they chose to kind of do a creative take on that bar graph, making a triangle shape, which obviously suggests to you mountain, and then taking a sort of section of a photograph of that mountain to fill in the shape on the chart. So you're not just looking at colors or monotonous sort of lines, but you're getting to look at the texture of that actual mountain. It really creates a nice visual interest there in a way that flat colors don't always do. And at the same time, you'll note that it's still a really well held together color scheme. They chose sections of these photos and maybe edited them a little bit to kind of fit into this blue-gray scheme that they're working with. Space is our next element to talk about. It's a really subtle here, the way that space is used, but if you look closely, you can see that Bobby Kennedy's head is in front of the two N's in Kennedy, and that just conveys to you that sort of the relationships in space of where things are. All of a sudden, you're going to view those letters as being behind him, as opposed to just on top of him or something like that. It's a subtle thing there that really draws the viewer's eyes to the face as like the foreground object, and then even though you have the bright text behind, it's still letting you kind of letting the face compete a little bit better with the words, even though the words are in color. Another way to think about space is negative space. In these instances of the Star Wars posters that were also reimagined by a graphic designer, they took the silhouette of different characters from these Star Wars movies, and they used the space inside of those silhouettes for the picture about the movie, which is pretty cool. And in this case, the negative space is actually the white, so if they'd flipped it the other way, you'd be looking at the negative. But think about, this is all incorporating these ideas of shape and really looking critically at the materials that you're given and the different words and characters and pictures you have available to you for a certain project, and trying to creatively seek out new ways to display that info. And I'm going to give you just a really quick note on typography because it's something that, you're probably using the most in your life as a designer or as you're working with graphic designers. This is just a silly little shirt I love. Helvetica Bold saved my life during a 200-page brochure project. everybody kind of has their go-to fonts. For some of you, you may be lucky enough that either the National AFL-CIO or your local has kind of given you maybe a style guide to let you know that, typically we like to use a certain font for a header, a certain font for paragraph text. If you're not that lucky, it's to have that given to you. And it's a good idea to develop a little bit of a style guide like that for you on your own. And that goes back to the repetition concept, where using fonts consistently is going to kind of brand your organization, but it's also easier for you as a person creating this content to not have to constantly come up with a new font scheme or whatever, because you go right to this little stable of fonts that you've chosen in your style guide. The basic types of fonts are serif and sans serif. Serif just basically means that it has the letters have the little sort of lines and whatnot that are the extra flair. I like to think of it as extra flair on the letters, whereas you look below at the sans serif and they're more sleek. They don't have those little lines like on the eye, etc. So those are the two basic font types that people will talk about. And oftentimes you'll see a combination of serif and sans serif fonts to create contrast. Like a heading might be in a big, bold serif, and then you might have sans serif paragraph text, or vice versa. They pair together pretty well. And another way to think about fonts is display fonts and text fonts. So you'll have some fonts in your stable that are bold, and maybe they can be read from further away. And then you have other fonts that are maybe a little bit quieter, but they are good for reading large blocks of text with. And a way to kind of tell which is which, I mean, you can obviously Google search anything, but if you have just a paragraph of text and you switch the font to something, if it feels sort of labor-intensive to read, you're probably not working with a great text font. And on the flip side of that, if you sort of print out a flyer where the banner title is in a certain font and you can't really read it from 10 feet away, let's say, maybe that's not a display font. So you can figure out kind of using those tools. You can also, I highly encourage anybody, especially as you're learning, to use Google as a tool for your learning. If you just Google something like, what are some great display fonts to use for a flyer or on a website header or in a Facebook graphic, you're going to get some pretty good results there. And granted, it's not like always the best choices, but it's a great place to start to learn about new fonts or font pairings that look really tasteful. And there are a lot of websites also like DaFont or Font Squirrel where you can download free fonts, but you're going to want to just be careful that you're using them in a sort of controlled way and not just kind of using every font that you find. This is an example from the cover of New York Magazine, where you've got that word television in an outlined serif font, and then you've got sort of the title of the magazine in a more sleek italicized serif font. But then it's a little hard to see here, but the date is in just a sans serif, I believe. Then down here, where you have Obama and the Gays by John somebody, the Obama and the Gays is in the serif, but the by John somebody is in a sans serif. So these things pair pretty well together. Same thing, this is just a Elle Decor magazine. In their own logo of Elle Decor, you'll see the text Elle is a serif font. The word decor is a sans serif font, and that's their sort of logo. Again, with the A-list, 60 top talents, you're seeing a contrast in serif and sans serif, looking nice together. It's just a nice sleek contrast. So we're going to look at some examples of crap in action. So that's your contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity in action. Let's say that at your organization you're given a set of these 4 different pictures that seemingly have no relationship to one another. The content is different, they're taken with different types of camera phones and whatnot, and the layout of them is all different, but suppose you get these 4 pictures and you're told that you need to combine them all into the cover of an annual report or something. This is where you're going to start using these principles in action to achieve your goal of a cohesive looking annual report cover that's not a total mess. So the first step that I would do in this instance is to use contrast and actually decrease the contrast by putting everything in a black and white. All of a sudden we've gone from lots of color information, lots of information, it felt a little busy and not cohesive, to something that's a little bit more restrained and cohesive, sort of the other side of contrast. Then we can use scale to make the elements seem like they sort of are living in the same universe again by scaling everything down to the exact same size and shape. So I've made everything the same size square at this point. Next, we'll use alignment to pull things together in a more organized way. It's also proximity. We've brought them closer, and you're reading it maybe as a group of information. And then maybe at the end, to, let's say, emphasize a certain piece of information or something, maybe you would make one of the images actually in color, so that then you're adding back in an additional element of contrast. So that's just one example of how you can take, crazy pictures that you're getting from all over the place in the field, and you're trying to put them together in an organized way. That's one way you can do that and employ these principles to your advantage. And the last thing I'm just going to quickly touch on is just on style and good judgment. Some of the websites I mentioned before, like DaFont, for instance, you can go on there right now and download a font that would allow you to type everything as though it were the opening credits of Star Wars. Should you do that? Probably not. So that's where the sort of style element and judgment comes in terms of design. So here's my example. Suppose that I am hosting a Bastille Day party. It's a little bit of a crazy example, but let's just suppose I want to celebrate French independence and I have a party. And my friend Mike comes over, and he's wearing a shirt, you notice, that has the colors of the French flag in it. So it's like a blue shirt with the red and white stripes. That's really tasteful. And let's say maybe Mike has with him a bottle of wine. That's great. He comes to your door, you're like, great, you're prepared for this Bastille Day party, it's totally tasteful, come on in, let's have fun. But let's suppose he also brings, he's wearing a beret. If he shows up at my door like this, I might start to wonder, like, are you trying to make fun of my French heritage? I don't know. And then let's say he also has a baguette and a necktie and a fake mustache. At this point, Mike has really taken this theme of the French Bastille Day party and kind of gone totally off the rails with it. If he shows up like this to my doorstep, I feel like he's kind of, making fun of my French heritage. He's being a parody of a French person. Maybe this is offensive. He really should have stopped at the bottle of wine. And it's the same thing with design, where oftentimes you can do a lot of stuff, especially if you start to learn new software tools or this or that. You can all of a sudden, make blinking text in neon colors that looks like it's glittering, and, have 700 different new fonts that you love. But if you're incorporating all of those into one piece, you're going to start to look like Mike coming to my front door in an offensive outfit. So, and a lot of those home design shows that you might watch, at the very end, after they've done like a big room makeover, they'll tell you to edit and like remove 2 accessories from the room. Sometimes in design, especially when you're starting out, that's a good rule of thumb as well, to take a step back and think about, well, can I pare this down more? How many fonts am I using? Is it too many colors, etc.? Do I need to scale it back? So it's great to learn all the possibilities of what you can do with this stuff, but just remember that you want to always try and keep it tasteful and consider your audience, etc. So I know that was a ton of information to throw out at you, but hopefully it gave you a little bit of a new vocabulary that you can use to work with graphic designers, or hopefully you learned some concepts that you can put to good use in your own work. But now's the time where I'm going to take your questions, and I think Chris will sort of moderate that, so you can raise your hand. Or
actually, if you guys could use the notes and send us the questions through notes, we'll read them to Sarah, and then she can respond to you.
Great. So if you use that notes feature, and you can just type your question there, and I will do my best to answer your questions. So it looks like we have 4 notes right now. Maybe those are just... Maybe these are old. Okay, so Mike has questions about recommendations for software. Mike, on the professional side, there's really no equal to the Adobe Creative Suite, specifically Illustrator and Photoshop. Those are two really powerful tools, but they're also two really expensive tools. So if you don't have the money to, lay out like probably, I don't know, close to $1,000 for those two software items, you could get Inkscape. Inkscape is a vector editing program that will give you some of the functions of Illustrator. And then for the Photoshop replacement, there's a free software product called GIMP, G-I-M-P, and that will give you some of the functions of Photoshop. But those are sort of the main programs typically to look for in design. Caitlin wants a copy of the PowerPoint. I think we can do that, right, Chris? Okay, great. And sometimes my mouse disappears here, so just bear with me. Susan Charles, what makes a good header for a website? That's kind of a difficult question to answer. Susan, if you could follow up with, if you are curious about like fonts, or if you're curious about images, if you could narrow that question down a little bit, that would be super helpful.
And, Hi everyone, this is Jess from the digital team here at the ASL. Susan, a good, one of the trainings that we'll have in the future, sort of after this beginning series, is our advanced series that's going to talk a little bit about microsites and some of those pieces of stuff. So I think some of our other trainings in the future might answer those questions. Make sure you sign up for that.
Cool. We have a question here from Rosa. I've heard that putting text on the left side of a flyer draws the eye. Is that true? In general, you want to work with the different elements of your flyer or whatever it is you're creating to create some motion. And I want to see if I have an example that I can kind of show you. 1 second. I just want to scroll through here. My mouse stopped working. Here we go. I want to get a good example of like motion for you. And I might not actually have one in my presentation, but as a general rule, it's not so much about text being on the left side of a flyer, but more about the relationships that the different big elements are having. So let's look at this cover, for instance. It's obviously a magazine cover, not a flyer, but El Decor is sort of the biggest piece of information visually that you're getting there. And then your eye is pulled sort of down and over to the A-list thing, which narrows things down. If the A-list and that little text had been at the bottom right-hand corner, that would have created some dramatic motion for you to draw your eye down there. To make even more motion, maybe you keep this composition as it is, and then there's another piece of information in the bottom right-hand corner so that your eye is kind of flitting back and forth. In any case, it would create movement there, and that's something to think about as you're designing something if you want it to be visually interesting. Okay. Rob has a question. Legal issues on use of images. Can you recommend a source for free or non-copyrighted images and photos to create graphics? Yes. Again, I will send some links around to Chris to circulate with the group so that you have these, but you can search the Creative Commons and Flickr, where a lot of people have made their images available for all different types of use cases with Creative Commons licenses, and you just kind of have to give a reference note to who that was from, who took the picture oftentimes. There's also the Commons in Flickr, which is like Smithsonian Archives and other non-copyrighted stuff from museums and whatnot, where you oftentimes don't have to note the taker of the picture. And there's a website called Morguefile. It's kind of gotten taken over with some other like for sale image stuff lately, so the stock is less comprehensive. But on Morguefile, you can find completely rights-free images to use. And it's just worth noting that it's not a good idea to just go to a Google image search to find an image of, let's say, like mother and daughter or whatever it is that you need, because that's taking someone else's property if it's not a license-free photo. So please do try to use legal photos that either your organization owns or that you've gotten from one of these free sources. And one other note on that, one of the best ways to get content for your digital stuff is to tell your field people and whoever else is interacting and doing the work on the ground to be taking pictures all the time. Everybody's got a camera phone now. I just did a little training for my staff at the New Organizing Institute on how to take great pictures with your cell phone. Really encourage your field staff to do that and send you those pictures, because those become great content for things that you're wanting to do digitally. Let's see here. Liza Lopez design programs. The ones that I had mentioned before are Inkscape. That's Inkscape, Inkscape. It's a vector editing program that's similar to Illustrator. And the other one was called GIMP, G-I-M-P, and that is a photo raster editing program similar to Photoshop. And Susan, before when we were talking, Susan has a question about the website header. What kind of graphic would be good for a website header? If you remember from the beginning of the presentation when we were talking about Gestalt and how you're looking for the different parts of your design to be unified and part of a whole, so it's sometimes hard to answer questions like, is this too big, is this too bright, because you have to look at it in context of the whole. Same idea with a website header. One of my biggest pieces of advice, especially to people who are starting to dip their toe into the water of design, is to look at websites that maybe are from organizations that have a similar function to yours, or just websites you find appealing and easy to navigate. Take a look at the way that those are laid out, and think about if you can take elements of those to incorporate in your own site. And the same thing with, like, you know, before when I was mentioning taking a look at like the Obama Facebook page to look at graphics that might be good for sharing and getting ideas for how you might want to lay out your own graphics. It's great to just be looking at stuff that you love, make a note of it. I keep a Pinterest board of stuff that I think looks really good, so I can refer to it later. But I recommend that to all of you. I think we have time for a couple other questions. If you do have questions and you want to type them into the notes box, this would be a great time. I'm looking at this one from the Nebraska State Fed. Would you recommend we try to mirror fonts, branding, and design from national to create our own style book? That, I think, is up to, I guess, whatever. Yeah, I can't really answer that question.
I can answer this one. Thanks so much for this question, Karen. It's a really good one.
This is Jess.
This is Jess. Sorry about that. So I think that you know, you guys obviously need to make choices about your own organization, what brand you want to have, the kind of work that you're doing, etc. But we do think that our brand is a great brand. We think it's one that if a state Fed or CLC adopted, that they would, you know, be aesthetically pleasing and be within brand with the work that they're doing. So we think it can be a really good template. We know folks who sometimes use the font that we use, but we have like a gray, orange, white color scheme. Maybe they want to use red and orange color scheme, or maybe they want to use more emphasis on gray, less emphasis on orange, or use blue in the place where we use orange. So, you know, you can use it as a point of departure and then kind of put in your own pieces that you like, but definitely can be a helpful resource for you all as you move forward, and certainly something that we're interested in doing is getting sort of the labor movement as a whole to be a little bit better branded.
Yeah, and it's great. Like AFL, I'm sure, has spent a lot of money on getting a professional designer to create their look and their style guide. So instead of trying to reinvent the wheel on your own, to rely on that can be really helpful. Anybody else have any questions? Nicole says most of these examples have very little text. Any ideas for how to deliver a text-heavy document or brochure that will draw the eye so it keep people reading? Some ideas for that, Nicole, would be to basically, use these principles. The one example that I just showed, again, was the one with the circles and the repetition of that sort of poetry brochure that was in the presentation. But also, if you have like a magazine that's a favorite magazine to you, take a look at the way that magazines lay out text. You'll oftentimes see them having these sort of call-out boxes for more interesting quotes, where in the middle of these paragraphs of text of article, you'll have a large quote, and it'll be maybe in an italicized font in a different color, and it occupies its own little space, its own little rectangle. Take a look at different ways that magazines do that successfully that you like, and you can adapt from there and come up with some of your own ideas for that. But also keeping things consistent with a paragraph font that's being used and a heading font and subheading font that are being used consistently, that's helpful too.
And this is Jess. I just want to add up and say that one thing too, that part of the reason folks have a short amount of content is that short content can be more effective than long content. So I think also thinking about the fact that all of those examples have only a little bit of text can mean that you might want to, and I don't know the specific instance we're talking about here, but it could mean that you might want to rethink getting down to the really bare basics of your text and then potentially linking to a page or something from the flyer that folks could visit on their phones or whatever that has more of the information that they might read in a different setting.
Right. And a question from Rosa about, along with reference links, can you guys send out a Stylebook that National uses for website email blasting?
This is Jess. We can't send that out. Style guides are actually pretty protected, so we can't send that out to the whole list. But Rosa, if you want to email me directly, jmorales@aflcio.org, and we can talk about what I can send you. There are definitely some things I can send.
Right. Any other questions? Okay, and I'm going to pass it back over to Chris.
Hey everybody, I wanted to just say thanks so much. We had a huge turnout today. We had 100 people attend this training, so thank you for the time. We think these are really valuable. After the training, probably tomorrow morning, we're going to send you an email that includes a link to a survey for the training. And if you, the trainings, I think you have to take up to 3 trainings in the beginner section to be able to move on to the more advanced, which starts next month in June. So please make sure you fill out your surveys. That's how we can tell. So we'll send out a link to the survey, hopefully a link to the video that we're taking through this training, and then probably some additional follow-up information that Sarah's going to provide to me. And then also we'll definitely have a link somewhere to the training. But we wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. Thanks, I appreciate it, Tammy, letting Sarah know. Thanks, great job.
Thank you.
It's always nice to get positive feedback, so thank you guys so much. And please go to aflcio.org/digital training, so aflcio.org/digital training if you want to sign up for future trainings.
And also, another note, this is Sarah, I work for the New Organizing Institute as their creative director, and we do tons of trainings in person and sometimes online, but more in person. And we recently developed a whole graphic design curriculum that we'll be doing again probably this fall as a 2-day training. So if that's something you're interested in, check out the New Organizing Institute's website, neworganizing.com. And if you sign up to be on their email list, you'll get notices about all the different types of trainings. They also do like data, new media, blah, blah, blah.
And they do a lot of stuff specifically for unions. We even have the New Organizing Institute come to the AFL and train some of our staff, our senior staff here, on how to use Twitter and things like that, social media. So they do a fantastic job, which is why we asked Sarah to come over today. And Jess actually worked at New Organizing Institute as a trainer as well.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to sign off. We're back to end recording.